January was a month of brambles and thorn, of black earth and high summer magic. It was a time for me to turn inward, and perhaps a little leftwards and downwards. Sometimes books gather themselves like crows on a fence and spirits at the door. One leads to another, and as one listens a little deeper, perhaps the other side calls a little louder. And so I began to follow a thread into the dark and evocative practices which I once called home, but from which I had been lost for some time, and that old thread started with poison. Such rank and deadly lustre dwells as in those hellish fires that light the mandrake's charnel leaves at night. I have been growing poisonous plants and working with them in my practice for a number of years now. Datura was the first wayside spirit which called to me from the ragged roadside, and comes and goes in my garden as it pleases. Some of the other nightshades are a bit more capricious and persnickety, and the mercurial nature of our summer weather makes it a bit more complicated and difficult to keep them happy. But continue to grow them I will, even if it does take another 100,000 seeds to get them to come. Because of my deep-in-the-bones love for these poisonous, verdant beings, the book Botanical Curses and Poisons, The Shadow Lives of Plants by Fen Inkwright was a must-read for me. I listened to this as an audiobook, but really do hope to own my own copy one day. It is a visually stunning book, with dark, intricate, and almost devotional illustrations, which is enough to make any poison witch swoon. Inkwright explores plants known for their poisonous, deathly, or otherwise shadowy nature. She moves through species that have long been associated with danger, power, and the liminal spaces between healing and harm. Death and healing commonly walk hand in hand, and many of these plants were seen as representatives of these dual realms assigned to the early deities and spirits who walked the same line. The book opens with a series of brief introductory chapters that set the tone for what follows. These chapters touch on the history of poisoning and the cultural fear that has always surrounded toxic plants. She also discusses the role of these plants in witchcraft, particularly in relation to flying ointments and altered states, as well as offering a short overview of their use in medicine. While these chapters are brief, they do whet the appetite for the more in-depth information which is found in the A to Z section. Many of the entries offer a poetic introduction to the plants with a poignant and beautiful epigraph drawn from law or literature. Each entry then details the folkloric and historical understandings and usages of the plants, offering glimpses into each plant's darker associations. Of hydrangeas, that old-fashioned beauty of the cottage garden oft associated with our grannies, Inkwright writes, despite its popularity, the plant actually contains low levels of cyanide, which can, in large enough doses, cause nausea, vomiting, and sweating. Fortunately, it does not contain enough to pose a threat to most gardeners. In the Victorian language of flowers, it represents heartlessness. Planting hydrangeas at your door was said to doom your daughters never to marry, and Victorian men would send bouquets of hydrangeas to women who had turned them down, perhaps in the hope of bestowing the same curse on them. Perhaps there is indeed some truth to the law, as I remain unwed, but attached, and did grow up in houses with hydrangeas by the door. I enjoyed navigating through this treacherous dark garden of poison and malice, and cannot wait to get my witchy fingers digging through the dirt again. If you love to learn about folklore and history of poisonous plants, and appreciate beautiful art, you will probably love this book. What this book is not is a practical tome on how-tos of these poisonous and deathly beings, and if you are looking for something like that, you won't find it within these pages. For books with a more practical side to them, I recommend the works of Corinne Boyer, Kobe Michael, and Harold Roth. He exists by his very nature on the periphery of things, and it is in this understanding that we find the true nature of his power. He is, much like his witches, a spiritual potency that many have tried to contain and subjugate over time, a captive of a condition he did not choose, a wild force like the very soul of the witch that others would like to see tamed, not only as a folkloric theme, but in magical acts aimed at controlling him. And yet, one of the deep mysteries of the witch's devil is how his nature as a bound spirit does not weaken him, but instead seems only to increase his potency. It has been a long time since I engaged in devilry, and my darkling little heart has been aching for it. And so down the deadly thorned paths I went looking for something dark and enticing to follow up on my poisonous explorations, and fell upon The Witch's Devil, Myth and Law for Modern Cunning by Roger J. Horne. The folklore and practices surrounding the devil have always fascinated me. He is a being steeped in mystery and darkness, and tied closely to the folklore of witches and our pagan spirits, often supplanting them in older myths and legends. So I was looking forward to reading this little tome to spark the fires of hell broth beneath my witchy little feet. This book is a poetic treatise on the folk understanding of the devil as the cunning man's friend, a crossroads spirit, the one who walks between hedge and field. Throughout the text, Horne explores the devil's presence within modern practice, myth, and older cunning traditions. Each chapter delves into a different aspect of the devil, as bound spirit, an illuminating being, the spirit in the green, poisoner and magician, sabbatic goat and serpent. I was quietly delighted to see mention of the puka, that shape-shifting Irish spirit trickster guide and fairy being who is part of my own practices. Horne writes, within the category of bestial shape-shifting spirits, one such entity that has survived in fable and has recently enjoyed an elevated status in folk witchcraft is the puka, also rendered buka or puka, depending on the region. In Celtic fairy lore, the puka appears as a jet black goat, horse, dog, bull, or humanoid figure. As a shapeshifter, he is described as taking different forms in different settings. His nature is neither entirely malevolent nor benevolent, but complex, offering either boon or bane depending on how the spirit is approached by humans. Horne then goes on to retell a version of a puka tale from Yeats and follows up with this. It is no wonder that folk witches conceive of the puka as an aspect of our devil. Here he takes the form of a black goat or bull and becomes a sort of psychopompic figure, carrying the protagonist away to the hidden gathering of spirits that was and remains analogous to our witches' sabbat. Those who have read some of my previous writings will recall my own experience with the puka and a little bit of absinthe, where I was taken to a sabbat, riding inside his belly in good form. I drank absinthe, the venom of the green fairy, and the puka came to me, maybe not even for the first time. In my dream he was chasing my puppy around playfully, and I'd kept a part of my door locked, at first frightened, not knowing whether this creature would be to harm or to help. After a while, I braved opening the door. For the purposes of regathering my thoughts and re-examining my practices, this book felt like a small spark in dry moss, reigniting my lust for the darkly beings of the other side, whose voices whisper beneath the brambles. In fact, shortly after finishing this book, I bought myself a new blackberry plant. I even shared a short video of myself repotting it while mentioning some of its associations with this trickster being. I recommend this book to anyone looking for the devil within our practices, but who may be too shy or frightened by the overtly Christian associations that many think him to have. This book shows that the devil is far more than a Christian being, and in fact has come to represent the preservation of our much older practices within his story. It was probably in Ireland that Anne learned at her mother's knee some of the beliefs and superstition that she was to pass on to her own children. It was also from her mother that she inherited the powers that she was to draw upon later in life, powers that were to sustain her in her craft. Superstition played a vital role in the lives of the Romanese. They believed that evil spirits roamed the night searching for victims, and among the charms they carried for protection against these spirits were the hold stones, the breastbones of jays and kingfishers. Still craving the cunning ways of the old folk, I went beyond the hedge and stuck my thumb into the dirt, prickled with blood, and while there, stumbled upon Anne Joan the Crone, The History and Craft of the Cornish Witch by Calvin Jones. Cornwall has such a strong, strange current of witchcraft, pirates and wayside spirits running through it, that I can't help but feel a deep pull towards its craggy land and its windswept moors. Granite tors rise from the earth like ancient altars, hedgerows are thick with bramble and foxglove. Sea mists roll in without warning and swallow whole coves. It is easy to imagine cunning folk walking those narrow lanes at dusk, charms tied into red thread, murmuring blessings against ill wind and ill will. With my long-distance love affair with this bewitched land and its stories, I found the first section of the book, which details the lives and recorded accounts of Cornish witches, wise women, and pillars, deeply fascinating. I was particularly struck by the story of Joan herself, a woman who suffered in both life and death, not even her body and bones having rest as she was dissected, paraded, and displayed for years after she died. Joan White, also known as the Fairy Woman of Bodmin Town, was finally laid to rest in 1998 by Graham King, the then owner of the Museum of Witchcraft. Because of how compelling I found the first section of the book, I was expecting the next section to dive deeper into certain folk practices. Unfortunately, even in such a short pamphlet, the latter portion began to feel repetitive, revisiting some of the same stories from the first half without adding much new analysis or insight. More than that, I grow increasingly cautious when books blur the line between historical record and modern overlay. Jones states that, in fact, the concept of doing harm to others is not part of the European witchcraft tradition, despite the immense propaganda disseminated by the Inquisition of the medieval period, and is entirely an invention of their paranoia. This is a rather spurious claim, as while propaganda certainly played a role in the persecution of witches, we know that magic workers since time immemorial have practiced cursing and other forms of malefic magic. They aren't merely fictions espoused by the enemies of the witch, but are real folkloric practices embedded within old craft, even going as far back as ancient Greek curse tablets, and dark and twisted love puppets to make a lover sicken and die if they do not come to one's call. Evidence of such workings exists even in Cornwall, and they are recorded and kept at the Museum of Witchcraft. It feels a bit disingenuous for Jones to ignore that in favour of a cleaner and softer practice. Even so, I am glad to have read this book, as I enjoyed learning more about the stories of these enigmatic wise women who lived in Cornwall, and I remain deeply fascinated by this landscape, its history and folklore. As I continue to follow the red thread of poison, devilry, and old craft down the crooked road, I am reminded that the old spirits and their stories linger in the hedgerows and brambles. The voices of this other, numinous place may get drowned out by the loudness and instant gratification of our own broken world, but the spirit world is always within reach for those who dare to answer its call and follow its path.